So what do you do with all of your food scraps? That was the question I asked all of you the other day, and the results did not surprise me. 60% of you throw them right in the trash, and only 20% of you compost them. Now those numbers need to change, especially because I know for a fact that most of you are avid home cooks, which means you build up a lot of food scraps, and I think just throwing them in the trash is a waste that can be avoided most of the time. There are so many great options to compost your food scraps, and in today's video I'm going to be covering as many of them as possible. And that goes for every cook, whether you're a gardener or a non-gardener, or you have space or you don't have space. With just a little bit of education, I think we can work together to turn this ratio around. So the first thing I want to cover is why we should all be composting our food scraps. Now it's much more obvious for a gardener. When you compost these, you get free fertilizer for your garden. But as home cooks, we are plowing through fresh ingredients. We're talking the perishable stuff like vegetables and fruits and meats and dairy, all of the things that break down very quickly. And when you're cooking, a decent percentage of these ingredients are not actually making it into the final dish, whether it's peels or skins or roots or bones, or just ingredients that spoil that you don't want to consume. This waste builds up very quickly, and like you saw before, a lot of times it just goes right into the trash can. So why is it bad to be throwing out your food scraps in the trash can? Well, it turns out that 37 million tons of food goes directly into landfills a year, and landfills end up being anaerobic environments, which means they have a lack of oxygen. And when all of these organic foods break down with no oxygen, they create methane, which is a greenhouse gas that is actually more potent than CO2 in regards to emissions. On top of that, the more food we're throwing out ending up in landfills, well, that's growing the size of our landfills, just taking up more space on this earth, versus the alternative, which is composting. Now, the next logical question is, what the hell is composting in the first place? And I think the easiest way to answer that is just by looking at the natural cycles of life and death on this earth. Let's take a plant as an example. So a seed falls into the earth, it germinates and sprouts, and it starts to grow and grow into a bigger plant. And eventually, over time, it hits the end of its life cycle, it drops more seeds, then it dies, and slowly starts to break down and get absorbed back into the earth, while simultaneously feeding the earth through the nutrients in the decomposing plant. And then from that exact same spot, another seed sprouts and a new plant's journey begins. Now, composting lies right here in this section, the breaking down of organic matter and feeding it back into the earth. Now, nature has been using this recycling process forever. It's going to continue doing it. Everything will break down eventually. A rock will break down, metal will break down. It just takes a really long time. You will break down eventually and go back into the earth. But human beings, we are the first species to really just interfere with this process with some dramatic repercussions on the environment, which is why we are focusing on food scraps today. That is something that is simple, that is in our control, that can make an immediate difference in your garden, in your yard, or just the environment as a whole. Now, before we talk about specific composting strategies, I just want to quickly touch base on food waste in general in the kitchen, which should be your #1 priority before you ever get to composting. And this is something I've tried to push in my videos for many years now, just using up what you have in the kitchen, which will ultimately create a scenario where less food in your fridge is actually spoiling and going into the trash. And if you struggle with this, I would say the best place to start is to challenge yourself. I've done a few challenges on this channel that have completely shifted my mindset, where I forced myself to use what I have before going to the market. And this shifts your mindset into a much more creative space in the kitchen, where you can't be reliant on what you're used to cooking or certain recipes that calls for specific ingredients. You just make stuff with what you have, and I'm telling you, the reward is huge. You're gonna feel great for just using things up and not letting food go in the trash can. A lot of you commented in on that poll that you use your veggie scraps to make stock with. That is also a great way to reduce waste. You keep a bag or a container, you throw in your scraps, you can freeze them as they build up, and then when you have a nice supply, put them in a pot, make a veggie stock. But your scraps, of course, will only take you so far. Like, what are you gonna do with a bunch of banana peels? Which takes us into composting. All right, I'm sitting on a composting bin to tell you about my method for composting food scraps. Now, composting can be a very complex and scientific subject, and I think for the most part, that ends up just scaring people away. My goal is to not turn you into some composting expert. I am not an expert myself. I compost like I cook in the kitchen. I don't follow recipes, I just throw things together and hope for the best, and usually it turns out fine. And at its core, composting is 4 elements. You have nitrogen-rich materials, carbon-rich materials, water, and air. Now in this case, it's pretty simple because right here, our food scraps, that is all of the nitrogen-rich materials that you need. And you can compost really any perishable food scraps that will break down. I throw in everything in here. Vegetables, fruits, dairy, some smaller bones that will break down. The key is getting some type of bin that will always sit on your kitchen counter, so you have an easy place to just put all of your scraps as they come up in your cooking prep. You can get a fancy bin online. I end up just using these Cambro plastic containers, which has a nice tight lid to keep in those odors, and also it makes it easy to transfer to the composting bin. And then we mix these nitrogen-rich food scraps with some type of carbon material. Anything dry and brown, basically, like these wood chips. That could be cardboard, that could be hay. You can get these materials from your yard, like dried leaves. You can buy them from the nursery. I love using these wood shavings that I use for my chickens. They break down really easily and create a really nice compost. You mix those 2 things together in a composting bin, give it some water and air, and boom, you've got compost. But let's talk about these bins for a second. All right, this is the composting section of my garden right here. And one thing is, you do not have to be a gardener to have a composting bin. If you have a lawn or a little space in your backyard, you get one of these bins, you make some compost with your food scraps, you sprinkle it on some flowers or your grass, and it's gonna just fertilize the shit out of it. Now this right here is a more traditional composting setup, a 3-bin setup. And I use that for all of my garden scraps and my yard scraps, and that composts down over time, and I use that to fertilize my garden, which is great. And you can throw your food scraps in a regular composting bay like this, but obviously food scraps will attract animals. So what I like to do, and I would suggest to probably a lot of you, is to get a separate plastic container like this for just food scrap composting. And I bought these cheaper ones on Amazon a few years ago for under $100, and I thought they would be animal proof, but something bit through them and created a huge mess, which is why I upgraded to this thing right here, which has been a beast. Also, if you're nervous about animals, you can get a tumbler compost like this, which will make it much harder for animals to climb and chew up that bin. So really, all I have to do, open this thing. You can see I have a layer of this hay. These would be my brown materials on top. I even have egg carton that will break down over time. Brown materials. You can see right under there, these are my nitrogen materials. And just think about lasagna. This is your cheese, that goes on. Brown materials, we'll call that the pasta. Layer, layer. Now the more layering you do, the more heat you'll build in your compost, which will break down your compost faster. I'm not hyper obsessed with having super hot compost all the time. If it gets hot in there and breaks down quicker, that's great, but eventually it will break down. And one thing that will really help with that is this thing right here. So like I said, we need air for compost. So this is a compost aerator. There's different forms of these things, but the general idea is just digging down in your compost, pulling from the bottom to give it some of that aeration, create that oxygen flow in there for proper breakdown. Now the compost is going to be breaking down from the bottom up since we're adding fresh materials in the top. And you can really see that right here. And you can see things like this bag. Shells are going to break down a lot slower. Look at this layering. I did not add any worms. They just come, they grow, and they help break down that compost. Now, on the topic of worms, a lot of you brought up vermiculture, which is also another good way of disposing of your food scraps. That's basically using worms in a specific setup to break down your food scraps. Some people do this under their sink, which is a little bit crazy, but you can set them up outside, of course. I personally am not using a vermiculture setup because, as you can see here, there's so many worms, and it's pretty much doing the same thing just in my composting bin. All right, so that is my specific composting setup for food scraps. Now, I mentioned before, I will not be leaving out anyone who doesn't have a yard or garden. That is coming next. But first, I wanted to tell you about today's sponsor of this video and a new partner on the channel, which is American Giant, a clothing company that I really love and I think just goes well with the theme of this video. They make high quality clothing that is built to last, not some fast fashion that ends up in the trash. And I find their clothing has such a great balance of style style, comfort, but also durability, which makes it such a great option for my lifestyle because I don't have garden or cooking specific attire. I like wearing clothing that's comfortable, that looks good, but can also hold up in the garden or in the kitchen while seamlessly being able to work in the rest of my life. And what's great is that all of the clothing is made in America. I actually talked to the founder, and his idea was creating a company that retained a connection to the people actually making the products. Now, all their gear is great, but I am obsessed with their hoodies. I don't think I have taken them off since I got them in my wardrobe. Phenomenal. If you're a hoodie person, they were considered the greatest hoodie ever created. And their women's clothing is great as well. My wife has a bunch of stuff that she absolutely loves. So if you want to support the channel, An American Giant, check out the link below in the description and use code word MikeG for 20% off your first order. Now we're going to go inside to talk about other composting techniques. Now, to be honest, my composting motivation definitely went up when I got a garden because one, I had space to do it, and two, I get the direct results of the fertilizer in my garden, which is great. But I will say when I didn't have a garden, I was still composting. There's lots of ways to still get in the game. So the first thing I want to bring up is this machine right here. This is the Lomi right here. It kind of exists in a new category of at-home composting machines. Not actually a composting machine. What it does is you pop in your food scraps and it slowly grinds them and dehydrates them and turns them almost into a dust, which is great if you have a small space and you can't have an actual composting setup like I just showed you. Now, you wouldn't do this to throw that in the trash. That would be a waste of energy for running the machine. But there's other things you could do with it. You could take it to a community garden. You could sprinkle it in your plants. I used it on my garden beds. I even made a fertilizer with it by adding it to some water, letting it sit for a few days and watering that into my plants, which seemed to actually perform quite well. Now, this video is not sponsored. Lomi did send me this product to try and the results were good. There are other products like this on the market. There's some cheaper products. Now, another option, of course, is a lot of cities or towns either have or are starting composting efforts, which is great. I know when I was living in Brooklyn, during the time I was living there, there was a composting effort that started up. They gave you a composting bin, you put your scraps in there and put it out on a certain day of the week, and they took it, they composted it for you, which is fantastic. That's not happening in every city, but I am seeing a growing trend. And there were a lot of comments on this post for all different types of community efforts for composting, which is just fantastic. That did not exist in, say, my parents' generation. So things are slowly changing for the better. Now, also a lot of farmers markets have composting efforts. They'll collect your food scraps. For me, again, when I was living in Brooklyn, I could take my food scraps to the local farmers market. I didn't know exactly what they did with it. They might have distributed it to a farm that composted it, but that is a great option. Speaking of farms, that is another option. If you have a local farm, there's a chance that you can drop off your food scraps at the farm and they'll compost it in their composting system. Some farms just want more organic materials for their compost. And I think that covers most of it. If you have another form of composting or another way to get rid of your food scraps, comment in below. Let the people know, because we need to turn this ratio around. This is just no good. And a lot of it just comes down to education, really. I mean, when you look at my parents and their generation, no one was talking about composting outside of farmers. And now it is a term that people are aware of. There's a lot more education out there, and I do think we're headed in the right direction, but we gotta keep pushing, my friends. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.